Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Morty and Glory video. In today's episode, I will be taking you through step by step my recommended beginner list for new Imperial Guard players. This list takes into account all of the changes that came with the Arks of Omen season of Warhammer 40k. The aim of this video is to provide a comprehensive guide to new Imperial Guard players and a list for them to be able to build towards as they are getting their Guard army together. I will be covering everything from the individual units taken and their war gear through to pre-game relics and stratagems, as well as some basic tactics for how you can operate this list on the battlefield. But without further ado, let's crack on with today's video and dive right into this. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is that this is not the most competitive, top-tier, tournament-winning list that you can take and build with your Astra Militarum Codex. There are tons and tons of fantastic and cool strategic and tactical combinations that you can put together with the new Guard Codex. It really is a treasure trove of fantastic units and abilities. However, many of the most powerful things you can do with the Guard Codex require multiple layers and a really in-depth and innate knowledge of the faction as a whole. This can just be a little bit overwhelming and complex if you are a new player to Warhammer 40k, and even if you are a veteran player of 40k, if you're getting into the Guard for the first time, there are a lot of data sheets and a lot of different things you can do with this book, and it might just be that the best thing you can do is, rather than going for that most complex and over-the-top thing right from the beginning, is building a list like this that will allow you to get to grips with all the different aspects of the Guard and really get a feel for how that faction plays on the tabletop. And that was one of the biggest factors that I took into account when building this list. And also, I wanted to focus on those units that really made up the core of any good Guard list. Your Guardsmen, your tanks, and some of your fire support units. So when you see this list, you may not agree with every single unit that I put into it, but just remember that I'm not looking at this from a purely competitive point of view. I'm looking at this through the lens of a new player getting to grips with the faction. Another thing that was a big factor for me was taking into account the kind of box sets that people start their Guard army with. Loads and loads of people have come into the faction with things like the Cadia Stands box set or the Combat Patrol and start collecting box sets. Therefore, I have used the units that come in those box sets to form the foundation of the list we're going to be looking at today. Overall, I would describe this army list as simple to pilot, easy to understand. It will help you get to grips with the Guard as a faction, really understand how they play on the tabletop. But at the same time, I have put a few interesting combinations in there to keep it exciting and fresh. You should be able to put this list together with easily available box sets from Games Workshop. And overall, it is a great way to start your faction. Many of the units that I've included in here are ones that you're going to be taking in your list for years to come. And with all that said, now let's get into everyone's favorite part of these kind of videos, which is the list itself. Let's get into that nitty-gritty detail. Now, to be clear, this entire army fits inside a single Arks of Omen detachment, and also the regimental doctrines that we have taken for this list will be Born Soldiers. I decided to keep it as simple as possible. We're not messing around with any allied attachments. We're not messing around with any particularly crunchy combinations of regimental doctrines. Born Soldiers and a single detachment makes it very easy to know what is going on in this list. Just in case anyone is not sure what Born Soldiers does, basically when you are shooting your guns, if you roll a 6 to hit on your dice, then that shot automatically wounds your opponent. You don't need to do a wound roll. They of course still get their armor save and any kind of shrug or feel no pain that they may have, but if you get a 6 to hit, you don't need to bother rolling to wound with that particular attack. Also, for the Arks of Omen detachment, the compulsory selection that we have gone for is heavy support. We want to try and fit lots of big guns in this army because big guns are the best, and also a lot of Guard players get attracted to the faction for the tanks and the artillery and all of that lovely firepower. So now that we've covered the abilities and detachments that we're taking for the list, now let's get into the units themselves, and as a tradition, we shall start with the HQ section. In this part of the list, I have taken 2 Cadian Castellans, a command squad, and a tank commander. This is a really balanced selection of officers. We've got a couple of senior commanders with those Cadian Castellans who are going to be closer to the front lines, providing their reroll ones, auras, and handing out lots of orders. But we've also got a command squad who can sit a little bit further back, can use that Voxcaster to be able to get those long range orders out, and also the fact that we'll be taking a regimental standard in this squad means that we'll have a source of reroll to wound. So between all of these infantry commanders, we're going to have 5 orders, several of them at short range. We've got a long range order in the back pocket, and we've also got multiple sources of both rerolls to hit and a source of reroll ones to wound. We have taken the tank commander because he is our source of mechanized orders in this list, and considering we will be taking a total of 4 Leman Russes, as you'll see later on, you definitely want to be able to boost those main battle tanks with some mechanized orders coming from this vehicle officer. Now, to just go through step by step what I've taken in each one of these units, on both Cadian Castellans, I have taken whatever war gear is free on them. Currently, at the time of recording this video, that is a bolt pistol and a power sword. However, if you're coming across this video later on, and maybe those are now paid upgrades, the key behind these 2 officers is to just take them as cheap as possible. If in the future they can only take las pistol and chainsaw for free, then those are the weapons that you want to be taking. The reason we're going for the free war gear is these guys are not there to do much damage directly themselves. We don't want to be paying for anything like that. We want those points to be going elsewhere in the list. We want to pay for guns that are actually going to do damage. Let me assure you that if you're new to Guard, it might be very tempting to buy things like power fits and plasma pistols for your officers. I mean, they're officers, surely they should have the finest of war gear. But the problem you'll find with that is you're basically throwing points away because they're never ever really going to shoot that plasma pistol unless things have gone very badly wrong. And if you find your Cadian Castellan in combat, then even some of the most basic Space Marine units or other faction infantry are going to beat the crap out of him. Guard officers are not there to lead heroic charges. Guard officers are there to support and be force multipliers to the rest of your army. Therefore, the best thing you can do is keep them as cheap as possible, keep them with whatever war gear comes for free, and spend those points you would have spent on upgrades elsewhere to do more damage with your list. Now, inevitably, someone is going to ask me the question at this point of, Mordy and Glory, how are you getting 2 Cadian Castellans in your list? Cadian Castellans are commandants, and you can only take 1 commandant per detachment, and as you're fitting this all in a single Arks of Omen detachment, surely you can only take 1 Cadian Castellan. This is probably my most frequently asked question. All the live streams and all the videos and all the battle reports, people are always asking me, how do you get 2 senior officers into your army list? And it's actually really simple. In the Arks of Omen book, there is a stratagem called Heroic Support. If you noticed at the beginning of this video, I had a few pre-game stratagems listed there. We'll be going through those as we go through the video. And this is the first one that we come across, which is Heroic Support. It costs 1 command point. And what this stratagem lets you do is take 2 units in 1 detachment that normally you can only take 1 of. So, for example, if you are taking Space Marines, normally you are limited to 1 captain per detachment. If you use Heroic Support, you can take 2. Likewise, Tau Commanders, normally you can only take 1 unless you're Farsight, but if you use Heroic Support, you can get 2. And we come to the Guard. Normally, you can only take 1 Commandant. You spend 1 command point for Heroic Support, and you can now take 2 of those limited units, which means you can now take 2 Commandants in single Arks of Omen. It's a really good question, and I think it's one that a lot of people have overlooked because it was only really highlighted in one Warhammer community article. And what's really funny is I think a lot of Guard players are accidentally hamstringing themselves and not taking that extra senior officer when they really, really want to, and they actually do have that ability to do so. So there you go. That is how I am getting 2 Cadian Castellans in my army. Make sure you are doing the same thing as well. Next up, we have the command squad. Now, straight away, I know some people are going to be asking, is this a platoon command squad or is it a Cadian command squad? And honestly, it doesn't matter too much. The ideal loadout for this command squad is you're going to have your officer. Again, he's going to have free war gear. Then you're going to have a regimental standard, and then you're going to have a Voxcaster. Now, after that point, it's really going to determine whether you personally are going to go for the platoon command squad or the Cadian command squad. If you are thinking of taking this squad and you are going to take it with a medic and a single special weapon, then you might as well go down that Cadian route, because you're not taking advantage of anything that the command squad brings to the table. You're not taking advantage of the extra special weapons. You're not taking advantage of the ability to take a heavy weapon in there. And you might as well take a Cadian command squad, because it'll be exactly the same as Platoon, but you'll get access to a few extra stratagems. So if you're thinking of taking Regimental Standard, Officer, Vox, Medic, and a single special weapon, go down the Cadian command squad route. If you're thinking of going for Officer, Regimental Standard, Voxcaster, and a couple of special weapons, or a heavy weapon team in your command squad, go down that Platoon Commander route. The important thing is those first three, that Officer, that Regimental Standard, and that Voxcaster. After that, it's really dealer's choice of which route you want to go down. So why am I only focused on those first three unit options? Why are they really the main focus of this command squad? Well, firstly, you need to take an officer. You haven't got a choice there, so you need to take one. And like with the Cadian Stellans, just give them the free war gear for exactly the same reason. The main two unit options there are the Master Vox and the Regimental Standard. Now, the reason you really want to take that Master Vox is it's pretty much the only reason you're going to be taking a command squad. The Master Vox allows you to do your order from your officer to another unit 24 inches away. This is what separates the command squad from the Cadian Castellan. This is why, even though the Cadian Castellan can do 2 orders and the command squad can only do 1, you actually pay more for a command squad than a Castellan. A Castellan can only do his orders to units that are within 6 inches of him. So very short range. Man squad with the Voxcaster can do orders to another unit with a Voxcaster, let's say an infantry squad or a Cadian squad, that are 24 inches away. It's really long range, and it's really important because your Cadian Castellans are not going to be able to be everywhere at once. If you've got one of them in the middle of your army and one of them on the left flank, but the enemy starts focusing and concentrating on your right flank, you might not be able to get your Cadian Castellans over there in time to provide that support to your units. But if you've got a command squad, they can do orders 24 inches away, and they can stabilize that flank, and they can provide the buffs that may be very vital to in order to make sure that that flank does not collapse and actually is successful. So that's why the Master Vox is so important. It is the one automatic go-to upgrade you should be putting in every single command squad, regardless of what type it is, regardless of what kind of army you're fielding. After this, we have the Regimental Standard, and this is the second most important upgrade you can include in any command squad. The Regimental Standard by itself gives a reroll 1s to wound aura to all friendly core units that are within 6 inches of the command squad. Now, what's important to note here is that 6-inch reroll 1s to wound aura is not to the banner bearer himself, not to that one individual model. It's to the squad as a whole. So if you get kind of clever with this and you spread your command squad out a little bit, you can actually cover a really wide area with this reroll 1s to bubble. It's why we only need 1 command squad versus needing, again, 2 Cadian Castellans. Cadian Castellans are individual models. Their 6-inch reroll 1s to hit aura only affects units that are right next to them. But with that command squad, you can really spread it out, and you can get that reroll 1s to wound aura on a lot of friendly units. Another reason we're going to be taking the Regimental Standard is this is where we are going to be spending another pre-game command point. We're going to be upgrading that Regimental Standard to the relic, the finial of the Nemradesh First, also known as the Big Bullshit Banner of Doom. Now, this relic is probably one of the best relics in the whole of Warhammer 40k. I'm not just talking about the guard book. It's definitely the best one in the guard book, but it could be argued to be one of the best ones in the whole game. What this relic does is all friendly core Astra Militarum units that are within 6 inches of the command squad get to ignore any to hit modifiers. So if your opponent's got -1 to hit inbuilt into one of their units, or you're shooting over some dense terrain, or they've got a stratagem, matter, you ignore any to hit modifiers. You also get to ignore any rules that your opponent has that would stop him from losing wounds. Now, what this means in reality is they cannot use things like phase caps, and they cannot use things like feel no pains. Now, a phase cap is like when you're facing like Gazgul or a Baden or a Necron Catan, where it says this unit can only lose 3 or 4 wounds per phase. So even if you shoot your whole army at it, it doesn't matter. It can only ever lose 4 wounds per phase. But the big bullshit banner overrides that. Big bullshit banner says you cannot use any rules to ignore wounds that you would lose, including phase caps. So it's fantastic for dealing with those units that guard traditionally struggle with. Because we're primarily a shooting army, most of our damage is done in one phase. Those units that can only take a certain amount of damage per phase are really, really hard for us to deal with. Unless we've got a big bullshit banner, at which point we can just blow Gazgul off the table in one go, blow a Baden off the table in one go, and send all of those Catan shards back from whence they came. What's also really important to note is, as per the latest Rare Rules FAQ on the Warhammer community website, the big bullshit banner now also ignores any rules for damage reduction. So for example, if your opponent has a Dreadnought, and normally that Dreadnought would reduce your overcharged plasma shot from 2 damage down to 1 damage, doesn't matter, the big bullshit banner overrides it. You cannot use reduced damage rules against the big bullshit banner of doom. This relic is such a massive force multiplier, and again, because you can spread your command squad out, you can affect a huge amount of friendly units with it, and honestly, it is an auto include in every single list that you are taking. So that covers all of our infantry officers, their loadouts and upgrades. Now we've got to take a look at the tank commander, our mechanized officer. Now we're going to equip our tank commander with a battle cannon, a las cannon, and 2 heavy bolters. This is affectionately known as the El Clasico loadout. Now the reason it's called the El Clasico is because it has been featured on the box art and the artwork of the Leman Russ since the very beginning of the Imperial Guard faction. Wherever you go, you will always find pictures of the Leman Russ with the las cannon in the front, heavy bolts on the side, and that cheeky battle cannon on top. Now, it's not only timeless on all of the artwork, but it's also timeless on the battlefield, because that loadout has never been a bad choice. There's always been better loadouts than it, but there's always also been worse loadouts. Other weapon systems wax and wane. Demolisher cannons last edition were the top dog. Before that, we were looking at plasma. Then it was something to do about Punishers spamming out millions of shots. But in all of the different ripples of the tide, it was always the battle cannon that everyone agreed was the most take-all-comers. You could put it into any game against any opponent and always be able to. Okay, and the same stands for the las cannon and the heavy bolters. And the reason why this loadout is so good, and even if it's not necessarily the most powerful, it's one you can always rely upon, is because it really brings a bit of everything to the table. The battle cannon can be reliably slung into almost any enemy on the battlefield, and it'll tear a chunk out of it. The las cannon provides that pinch of just extra proper anti-tank. When you come across like an Imperial Knight or something really gnarly, and you need that strength 9 just to make a difference. And the heavy bolters provide a smattering of anti-infantry firepower and volume of dice. Otherwise, you might find that your battle cannon, las cannon, are only putting out a few shots between them, but being able to have a couple of heavy bolters stuck on the side really ups the average amount of dice that this tank will be putting out every single turn. Now, here is where we're going to spend our third pre-game command point. We spent 1 on heroic support, we spent 1 on giving a relic to the command squad, and now we're going to spend another command point on Imperial Commander's Armory. This allows us to take an extra relic, and what we are going to take is Gatekeeper, and we're going to put it on our tank commander. Gatekeeper is a relic battle cannon, and it's pretty straightforward, guys. It's just much better. It has more reliable shots, it has a higher strength, it has a higher AP, it has the same damage. It's just a straight upgrade, and to be honest, it's probably an auto include for most guard commanders. If you're taking a tank officer, really you should probably be putting Gatekeeper on him, because he's the only Leman Russ that can take the relic. You can't put it on a normal tank. But that covers all of our HQ choices. Now let's move on to the elites. And we're going to be taking a couple of units in this area. We're going to be looking at a squad of Kazakin and a Commissar. Starting off with those Kazakin, these are the elite infantry of the guard and of this particular list. Now, Kazakin are built different to your regular guardsman squads. They hit on 3s natively, unlike guardsmen who normally hit 4s. They've got better standard rifles, they've got access to more equipment, they've got better armor, more attacks. They're overall just a big improvement. But they are a lot more expensive. A Kazakin squad comes in at 100 points base. A Cajun Shock Trooper squad costs 65. So it is a big difference between those two units. Now, I've decided to give this Kazakin squad the full works. Take as many upgrades as we can, as long as it doesn't cost us any points. So that means we're going to have a sergeant with a las pistol and chainsword. It's a hotshot las pistol, so it is AP -2. We've then got 2 Kazakin with plasma guns, 2 more Kazakin with melter guns, another Kazakin with a hotshot sniper rifle. We've then got a Kazakin with a hotshot las gun and a Voxcaster, and the other Kazakin are going to be taking just hotshot rifles. Now, that is a lot of firepower coming from a single 10-man squad. Some of you might be thinking, Morning Glory, why didn't you pay for a plasma pistol on the Kazakin Sergeant if you're really going for the full works? Well, I didn't want to pay the points for it because we want to make sure that we're not overspending on a squad that's already pretty expensive. And also the fact that most of the time you'll find your Sergeant's going to be yeeting a crack grenade at people, because Kazakin come with crack grenades. Another advantage that they have over your standard infantry squads. So he actually isn't really going to use that pistol. He's most of the time going to be just lobbing pretty high strength, high damage shots at people with crack grenade. But overall, like I said, it's a lot of firepower in a single squad. But the problem that Kazakin have is they're quite slow. They only move 6 inches like everybody else. So what we're going to do is give them a Chimera as a dedicated transport. And we're also then going to use the Kazakin's Warrior Elite ability to give them an extra regimental doctrine. And that doctrine is going to be Mechanized Infantry. Mechanized Infantry gives you the unique ability to be able to disembark from a transport after it has moved. Normally, you can't do that. And what this means is that your Kazakin squad can be a really effective spearhead unit or fantastic counterattack unit. Imagine you need to take an objective and your regular infantry are kind of struggling to do it. Well, you can send your Kazakin squad over there in their Chimera, jump out and just clear the entire area with all of those special weapons. It's a great way of just being able to add a rapid reaction force in. Or maybe the enemy's breaking through on one flank and you're really struggling to contain them with the force that you've got. Once again, in comes the Kazakin Mechanized Infantry unit. It can just travel 12 inches across the map. They can then get out 3 inches, so it's a 15-inch threat range, and then they've got all of those guns, and they can just start unloading on any enemy breakthroughs. They're a really flexible squad, and unless you're taking something like the Lord Solar and you're going for a really complicated tactic like the full-blown Kazakin bomb, this is the recommended way I would say you should be running your Kazakin in your guard armies. Now, I don't want to throw too much at you, but it would be remiss of me not to mention that these Kazakin, with the Mechanized Infantry extra doctrine, do get access to the Mount Up stratagem. This is a stratagem that you can use to get back inside your transport after you've fired all of your weapons. And there's nothing saying that you can't drive across the map in your Chimera, use Mechanized Infantry to get out of the transport, fire all your guns, spend 2 command points, and get back in. It's a really, really strong combo because it allows you to do damage with your Kazakin and then just keep them safe inside their metal box. It gets past one of the biggest weaknesses of Kazakin, which is they're still just infantry and they're still pretty easy to kill, and it means that your opponent has this really annoying constant threat that he has to deal with, and he has to chew through that armored transport to get at the stuff that's actually doing the damage to him. Really powerful, and it might be something that you want to avoid at first if you're really just getting to grips with the guard for the first few games, but definitely keep it as something at the back of your mind to try out once you've got a bit more confident with the faction. Next up, we have our Commissar. Now, we've included this guy in the list because we want to have a source of Prefectus orders. We've got every other kind of order. We've got regimental from our infantry officers. We've got mechanized from our tank commander. So it would be a good idea for us to be able to learn and use all of the different kind of orders. So that's why we've got the Commissar in there. Now, Perfector's Orders are a little bit specialist. You might find that in some games, you don't need them at all. And in others, they're completely game-changing and they win you the game. The point is, a Commissar is only 40 points. He's pretty cheap to include in your army, and he's a great way of having a bit of tactical flexibility. Like with our other officers, we're going to keep our Commissar as cheap as possible. Just take him with that bolt pistol and chainsword. No point upgrading him with the plasma pistol or power sword. He really isn't there to do much damage. Like all guard characters, he is there to support your forces. However, we want to make sure that he's not useless in some of our games. Just because his orders are situational doesn't mean that he has to be. And so we're going to spend our last of our pre-game stratagems here. We're going to give the Commissar a Warlord trait. Now, we're not going to be making him our Warlord. He can't be. That has to be one of our senior officers. Instead, we are going to use our Officer Cadre stratagem, which allows us to give a Warlord trait to another officer in our army who is not our Warlord. We are going to give the Commissar superior tactical training. This allows him to be able to do a kind of order that he doesn't already know. So, for example, he knows Perfector's Orders as standard. You can use superior tactical training to allow him to know mechanized orders or to know regimental orders. Now, in this case, we're going to go for regimental orders. Now, the reason we're going to go for regimental orders is it pairs really well with another unit that we've not yet seen in the list. We'll get to it later on in the video, which is the Field Ordnance Battery. Essentially, if we get into a game where we don't think we're going to need Perfector's Orders, our Commissar can babysit our Field Ordnance Batteries and he can give them take aim every single turn, which they're really going to need to be as effective as possible. However, if we're in a game where we think we're going to need those Perfector's Orders, we need the ability to fall back and shoot, ability to counter double obsec, or to be able to remain vigilant and push our enemy deep strikers back, the Commissar can do that, and one of the other officers can take over, and they can support the Field Ordnance Batteries instead. It just means we've got that flexibility on this Commissar, so he can either support the artillery in the list, or he can support the forward elements of the list, those that we think are really going to need those specialized Perfector's Orders. It makes him much more flexible, a lot less situational, and a lot more of a take-all-comers unit. That covers all of our elites, so now let's take a look at the backbone of the Guard, which is the troop section. And here we have gone for something very straightforward. We have taken 8 units of Cadian shock troops. But that covers all of our specialist elites. Now let's take a look at the core of any good Guard army. It's the poor bloody infantry. It's the troop section. Now, troops in the Guard are very, very important. You never want to skimp on them. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see new Guard players make is they don't take enough infantry and they get tempted away to take lots of fancy battle tanks and other cool, shiny units. However, having a really solid core of infantry is vitally important and is the biggest thing you can take away from this video. The reason you need 80 infantry, 8 squads of infantry, at a bare minimum really, is because they are going to be dying in droves. It is the life of a guardsman to die, but it is your duty as a commander to send them where they can die best. You should never be afraid to spend the lives of your men, but you should never, ever waste them. Your infantry are going to be performing some of the most difficult jobs in your army. One of those being screening your fire support. Now, screening is a very simple concept. You want to put something that's cheap and sacrificial up front so that it dies first and your more important and more viable unit gets to keep on fighting. In the case of the Guard, you want your infantry squads and your Cadian shock troopers to be up front so that they can absorb any charges, they can take the damage first from any kind of shooting. This will then allow your tanks to roll out and blast the enemy with impunity. If you don't take enough infantry, you'll find your army very susceptible to fast-moving assault-based forces. Those fast-moving assault armies are going to bound across no man's land in a single turn, and if you don't have enough infantry to block them off, they're going to quickly wrap up all your tanks, keep them locked in close combat, and you won't be able to do anything. But it's not all about dying and buying time and being a roadblock, although that is one of their most important functions. Your infantry are also going to be your principal objective takers. That's because they have a rule called objective secured. This means that if they are on an objective, and there's an enemy unit there on the objective as well, but that enemy unit does not have objective secured or a similar kind of ability, it doesn't matter how many models they have, you still control that objective. So infantry are really important for locking down primary objectives and making it so your opponent has a difficult time clearing you off. Speaking of objectives, many secondary objectives require you to do an action. And you're going to find more often than not that your infantry squads and your Cadian shock troopers are the ones that are going to be best placed to do those actions. Either because they've moved at the board and they've taken territory, they happen to be in a table quarter where you can do an action, or simply because they are the least valuable unit. You don't want your expensive Kazakin or Scions or any other kind of elite unit to be wasting their turn doing actions when you can have a cheap infantry squad do it and get the same outcome. And lastly, and one thing that often gets overlooked and something that I don't really make a big enough deal about, is infantry are really cheap, reliable firepower. At the end of the day, they're not going to cost you many points, and the amount of guns they bring to the table, it's actually pretty respectable, especially when you take into account things like born soldiers. A hail of lasgun bolts might not seem like it's going to do a lot on paper, but considering any 6s you get are going to auto wound, thanks to your born soldier regimental doctrine, enough of them can actually bring down some pretty big targets, and they can punch well above their weight. Infantry squads are deceptively lethal, and there's a saying that I always say in my guard armies, and it's something that I try and drill into people who are following the channel and who are asking for advice, which is, despite the fact you have all of these tanks and these super heavies and these elite infantry and all these other options in the guard, I guarantee you, in the majority of your games, it's always going to come down to the infantryman and his rifle. The one thing you could always rely upon. Now, you'll notice here on the slide that I've put 8 Cadian shock troops / infantry squads. Honestly, it doesn't matter too much which one of these you prefer to put in your army. I guess a lot of new players out there are probably going to have picked up Cadian shock troops, especially if you've gone for Cadiastans or a combat patrol box or something like that. So if you're taking lots of Cadian shock troops, the ideal loadout for all of those squads is drum-fed autogun, a Voxcaster, a plasma gun, and a melter gun. This loadout gives you loads of anti-infantry firepower with the autogun and the las guns, but it also gives you the ability to take down those big enemy monsters and vehicles with your plasma guns and your melter gun. Also, the Voxcast is going to be really good when we're looking at our secondary objectives, and also for making sure we can do orders at long range with our command squad. However, not everyone is going to have started off with Cadian shock troops. I know that with the new guard codex, a lot of returning commanders have been pulled back into active service. They've dusted off their old guardsman collections and they're starting to play more games with them. That's absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant to see some of the longbeards returning to the community. And for a lot of those players, Cadian shock troops didn't exist. They weren't a thing, and so they haven't really got them in their armies, and their forces aren't really designed to be built around them. So don't worry, you don't need Cadian shock troops. Infantry squads are just as good. The difference between a Cadian shock troop squad and infantry squad basically is the infantry squad can take 1 special weapon and 1 heavy weapon, and the Cadian shock troop squad can take 2 special weapons. Now, the Cadian shock troopers are better at those close range firefights by taking plasma and the autogun and the melter. Really, when you get within that 12-inch bracket, you're able to do a lot of damage, and that's where they shine. However, infantry squads have the advantage is that they can actually operate in longer range brackets. They can shoot their heavy weapons out to 36 inches or 24 inches, and it gives them a little bit more long range dagger. Honestly, they're both pretty much equal, and they're both going to do the same job that you want them to: take objectives, dive the Emperor, all that kind of good stuff. If you're taking infantry squads, my recommended loadout is a plasma gun and a heavy bolter. Failing that, plasma gun and a las cannon. If you've not got plasma guns at all, melter guns are a good substitute. After that, grenade launchers, but really, plasma guns and melter guns are where you want to be focusing. And your heavy weapon teams, really, you want to be looking at heavy bolters and las cannons. And if you're getting really desperate, autocannons are not a bad shout, although on paper they tend to work out as slightly worse than a heavy bolter. But I'm still a big fan of the old school autocannon. Now, up until this point, a lot of the focus of the list has been on various kinds of infantry, be they officers, or you've got your Kazakin, or you've got your Caden short troopers. Now we're going to be looking at the vehicles, the motor pool, and really a lot of the fire support and big guns of the army. First up, we have our fast attack section, and I've gone for 3 Scout Sentinels. Now, there are a number of reasons that I have included this unit in the list. Firstly, the availability to newer players. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but Scout Sentinels and Sentinels in general are really easily available to new Guard players because they come in the Cadia Stands box set, they come in some of the older army box sets, and they also come in the new Combat Patrol as well. So most Guard players getting into the faction where they're getting their first box sets together are going to find themselves with some Scout Sentinels. Even if you're not buying your armies new in box, you will find many eBay sellings, many Guard armies being sold online will include Scout Sentinels. They're one of those units that every Guard player doesn't remember buying, but seems to have loads of them lying about. So it's important to include these in the list because I think they're a unit that you will come across very easily. You'll be able to slot them into the list very effectively. And at the end of the day, they're also pretty good. So why not include them? Another reason I've put them in here is because they are light armor. And between the Scout Sentinels, the Chimeras, and the Lehman Russ tanks that we'll be looking at later on, you have the full spectrum of Guard armor. You've got light and fast, you've got medium all round, and then you've got your heavy Lehman Russes. And it just gets you used to using these different armor platforms. It makes you appreciate what each one can do. You'll find your Lehman Russes are able to soak up loads of punishment, but your Scout Sentinels are much more flexible and they're running around. So I thought including a variety of armor platforms would really get you to understand how all the different types of Guard vehicle feel on the battlefield. But another reason I included them is they're just downright good. For the amount of points that you're paying, you'll get an incredibly durable platform, which comes with decent firepower that the enemy can't ignore, and they're just a ton of fun to use because they gain access to things like the Maverick maneuver strategy, which allows you to move, shoot, and then move them again. So you can be really annoying to your opponent. You can be a bit of a troll face to them as you move your Scout Sentinels out from behind some line of sight blocking cover, shoot with them, and spend a command point and move them back behind that cover. And your opponent's like, oh, I just want to kill those Sentinels. And you're like, well, you can't because you can't see them. Maverick maneuvers, baby! So overall, they're a very easily available unit. They're a very fun unit, and also they're really useful for learning about the different kinds of Guard vehicle profile. Now, in terms of weapon loadouts and unit composition, you actually have a couple of options here. Firstly, you don't need to take them as one squad of 3 Scout Sentinels. You can take them as individual units. You have 3 fast attack slots available to you. You can put 1 Scout Sentinel in each one. The advantage of keeping them all together in one squad is it makes them more efficient when you're using Maverick maneuvers. You can use it to affect all 3 Sentinels rather than just one. And also it makes you more efficient for orders. You know, you can put an order on 1 Sentinel and it's going to affect the whole squad, which is great. However, the advantage of splitting them down into 3 individual models gives you a lot more flexibility. You can forward deploy your Scout Sentinels. That means they don't have to deploy in your deployment zone. They can go anywhere on the board as long as they're 9 inches away from enemy units or 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone. That means you can get them onto objectives early on, and if you've got 3 of them, then maybe you'll be able to get on 3 mid-board objectives right from the get-go, which in certain matchups would be very, very powerful and really difficult for your opponent to deal with. Regardless of how you decide to compose the unit, in terms of what guns to give them, I would keep them cheap. I wouldn't start spending things like underkiller missiles on them, and I probably wouldn't go for the Sentinel chainsaws as well. Sentinel chainsaws look cool, and I know a lot of Guard players are excited about them, but I don't think they actually bring much to the table, unfortunately. For me, I would keep them with a single gun, and I would either go for the plasma cannon or the las cannon. Now, the reason I would go for the plasma cannon is because it's D3 shots, and yes, it can overheat, but Scout Sentinels can benefit from the reroll ones to hit aura from your senior officer. They are core and they are regimental, so they can benefit from regimental orders like take aim, and they can benefit from reroll ones to hit auras and reroll ones wound auras. So plasma cannons are really good for those sentinels that you think are going to be staying close to your officers and gaining those buffs. If you think your sentinels are more likely to be lone wolves, be a bit more maverick, going out and doing their own thing, they're not going to be near any officers to receive many orders, and they're not going to be able to receive many auras either, then I would go for las cannons. Now, I'd go for las cannons because even though it's only one shot, if it hits, it's going to actually do some damage. And so that means that they're actually a threat, and it's something that your opponent can't just ignore. And if your Scout Sentinels with las cannons are perceived by your opponent as being an actual dangerous thing, then he's going to shoot them, and every shot that goes towards them is a shot that's not going towards your Leman Russes, which are actually the main threat in your army. But now we're going to be taking a look at the heavy support section. This is actually a really important part of the list. It's where we've spent quite a significant chunk of our points. And to be honest, this is the main draw for a lot of Guard players. People like tanks, and you'll find your best tanks in the heavy support area. Starting us off, I've gone for a squadron of 3 Leman Russ battle tanks. Now, like with the Sentinels, you can choose to have these as one squad of 3, or you can split them up into 3 individual units. Unlike the Scout Sentinels, though, who have to stay together as a single unit throughout the whole game, Leman Russes do not. You deploy them as a unit, but after that, they act independently anyway. The reason why I've included these as a squadron of 3 is because under the Arks of Omen's attachment, you only normally gain access to 3 heavy support slots. And as you can see here, we've taken a squadron and we've taken 2 field ordnance batteries. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that the compulsory section we were going for was going to be heavy support. That would allow you to split these up into 3 individual Leman Russes if you wanted to. The reason I include them as a squadron here is in case someone wants to tweak the list a little bit, maybe go with some more elites, or maybe go for some more fast attack, or maybe go for some more troops. So you can take them as 3 individual ones if you want. I've just written them down as squadron here to demonstrate that you are limited to 3 heavy supports unless you take heavy support as your compulsory Arks of Omen unit selection. But now that I've got that out of the way, let's take a look at these Leman Russ battle tanks. They are really, really good. They are your main battle tank. They are one of the strongest units in your army. They are available widely as well. That's a really big thing about Leman Russes. Not only are they good, but you can find them secondhand on eBay, Facebook market groups, all that kind of good stuff. You can also get them brand new in box in loads of different Guard starter sets. Not necessarily the new Combat Patrol or Cadia Stands, but the old Start Collecting set. If you're able to find those, great. I think Games Workshop might still sell them, but they might have moved on now, but there's still loads of third-party retailers with them in stock. You'll also find that if you ever come across some of the older like Christmas bundles that some third-party retailers have, you're going to find loads of Leman Russes in those kind of things as well. Games Workshop is always releasing new box sets with Leman Russes in, say, seasonal boxes as well, so there's just loads of ways of getting access to them, and you should be looking to get loads of them. They're a really, really strong unit. There's a reason I've included 3 of them here, plus Tank Commander means for a strong armored core to your Guard army is just as important as that strong infantry core that we talked about early on. These main battle tanks are going to be doing the majority of the damage in your list. Between them and the Tank Commander, you should expect to be able to dominate the shooting phase, even against armies like Tau, who are also very focused around shooting. They bring a level of durability that we've not yet seen in this army list. Pretty much everything up until this point has been infantry or light armor, things that you don't really mind if they die, and their job is almost to die on your terms. This is not the case with your Leman Russes. You want to look after them. You want to make sure that they are constantly putting firepower down, and the good thing is they've got a unit profile that helps you do that. They've got fantastic amount of wounds, great toughness, great armor save, so they're a really durable platform. They're going to shrug off light arms without any problems whatsoever. They've got extra durability upgrades like armor tracks, which makes them almost impervious to small arms fire. And also they have access to loads of cool stratagems like smokescreen and also ablative plating. Even if they get damaged, you can still make them operate on top profile with things like Relentless. Even if they die, you can still have them fire one last volley on death using Vengeful Salute. They just are great at constantly laying down that significant firepower that they bring to bear and absorbing loads of incoming enemy damage. They are tough and they are killy and they are your main damage dealers. However, the Leman Russ is a pretty venerable old girl, and as a result, she's been around for a long time and she's got loads and loads of different weapon loadouts. This can be a little bit intimidating for newer guard players. Which turret weapon should I be picking? What are the best combinations of sponsored and whole weapons? Don't worry, I'm here to give you some advice. You can't really go wrong with just spamming the El Clasico loadout. It's not the best loadout. I said that when it came to the tank commander. But it is timeless, it is take all comers, and it will serve you pretty well in any game that you come across. However, I do appreciate that it's kind of boring just spamming the same loadout over and over and over again. If you want to mix things up a little bit, I would strongly suggest that you look at the Executioner Plasma Cannon. It's like a battle cannon. It's short range, but it's got more armor penetration. Pretty good though. Also, I don't think you can go wrong with including a Leman Russ Vanquisher if you're willing to start experimenting with things like tank cases. There's some good combinations there. I'm not going to go into the full details. What I would say is I have actually done a video on Leman Russ loadouts. It's completely comprehensive. It breaks down all of the best combinations and gives you loads of advice on how to run these armored behemoths. I'll include a link to that video at the end of this one. So once you've watched this video and you've watched that video, you'll have a complete understanding of how best to equip your Russes and use them on the battlefield. But for now, like I said, you can't go wrong with the battle cannon and the Executioner. If you're feeling a bit fruity, take a look at the Vanquisher. The other ones, I'd wait until you watch that other video before you start playing around with them. Now, we're nearly at the end of the list. In fact, we've only got a couple more units to go over, but hopefully you can see the whole army coming together at this point. We've got a strong officer corps. We've got loads of infantry and heavy armor to form that really durable center of our list, that backbone to our army, and we've seasoned it with a few more specialist units like that Commissar, like that Kazakin, like those Scout Sentinels. But now we need to come over to the last part of the list, which is the indirect fire support, also known as the artillery. Now, at the moment, artillery isn't super popular in Warhammer 40k. That's because GW has an FAQ nerf out, which says when you shoot your artillery not using line of sight, so you're bombarding someone who you can't see, your unit suffers -1 to hit, and the enemy unit gets +1 to their armor save. Which means that for a lot of players, you're going to not be hitting very well, and even if you do hit, your opponent's probably just going to shrug it off. Fortunately, Guard are an exception to this rule because our artillery is actually pretty powerful and we have the capability of getting around that nerf, essentially turning that nerf off. Artillery is still really, really important in the Guard as well because it allows us to be able to target those units which we can't see. A lot of Imperial Guard firepower is direct line of sight. You have to be able to see your opponent. But if you're playing on a battlefield which has got loads and loads of terrain, you might struggle to bring your big guns to bear. Your opponent might just hide out of line of sight, focus on scoring objectives, and never really give you that solid, tangible fight that you desire. You can't bring them to the battle. This is where artillery comes in because it denies your opponent that option of doing that. A lot of people do want to play at cage against guard, but if you've got artillery in your list, they can't do that because you're still going to be bombarding them. Their plan of being all sneaky doesn't really work. So that's why I've decided to include artillery in this list because A, it's pretty quintessential for the guard, and B, it's actually tactically pretty important as well. Now, the artillery that I decided to include in this list were 2 field ordnance batteries. This is definitely going to be a bit of a controversial decision. I know there are going to be a lot of people down in the comment section going, Morning Glory, why are you recommending field ordnance batteries? Why aren't you recommending mortar teams? Why aren't you recommending earthshaker carriages? Both of those are better than the field ordnance battery. I don't disagree with any of these points, but I would remind you that when I was picking units for this list, one of the biggest factors was unit availability. Earthshaker carriages are better than field ordnance batteries, but they're a Forge World unit, and Forge World is very unstable. One day the unit is there available to purchase and you can put it in your list and everything's great. The next day, without warning, it's been discontinued on the website and it's gone into Legends. I'm not about to go and recommend a bunch of new players go and drop hundreds of pounds on expensive Forge World resin only to then find out that you can't use the units anymore. So that's why we're not recommending Earthshaker carriages. And the reason I'm not going for mortars is because they're not available in any starter box sets at the moment. You can't get them in your combat patrols, you can't get them in Cadia stands, but you do get field ordnance batteries in both of those. And most players that are new to Guard are going to have some field ordnance batteries sitting around. So that's why we're going to have them as our go-to artillery option for this beginner's list. In terms of loadouts, you're definitely going to want to give both of these field ordnance batteries the Field Bombast Cannon. This is the one that looks like a mini Basilisk cannon. It's got indirect fire, it's strength 7, it's AP-2, it's flat 2 damage, it's got a decent take all comers unit profile, and also it's the only one out of those options which can fire as arty, it can fire indirectly. The heavy las cannon can't, and therefore it's not going to serve a purpose in this army. Also, little side note, field ordnance batteries might look big and chunky. They're deceptively fragile. Your opponent will kill them very easily if you can draw a line of sight to them. So heavy las cannon's not really an option there. And then also the Malleus rocket launcher, you might think that thing can fire indirectly. I mean, if you look at it, it looks certainly like it can fire. It's got all those missiles pointing upwards, right? Nope, turns out that's direct fire. So again, that's not going to serve a purpose in this army. We're looking for something that can fire at the enemy without them being able to see it and fire it back. So that's why we're going to go with the Bombast Cannons. This is also where our Commissar comes in. Remember I mentioned at the beginning of the video we wanted to make him tactically flexible, even if there wasn't a fast assault army that he was going to help, push back or fall back and shoot against. We wanted him to be useful on the battlefield. This is where his superior tactical training comes in, because he knows regimental orders and he can sit with the field ordnance batteries and just tell them to take aim. Now, we don't need a command squad or a senior officer doing that job here, because field ordnance batteries do not benefit from the reroll ones to hit aura or reroll ones to wound aura, not core. So the Commissar actually works really well here because he can tell them to take aim and he frees up a proper officer to go out to the front lines to do proper orders and also affect units with their reroll ones to hit or wound auras. And take aim is very, very important because it allows you to get round the indirect fire nerf. Take aim gives your unit +1 to hit, which cancels out the -1 to hit. It gives your unit +1 AP, which cancels out the enemy's +1 armor save. This is why artillery is still very important in the Guard, and this is why Guard artillery is still the best in the game. Everyone else might be having problems with their RT, not the Guard. We still get to play that game. And last but certainly not least, we have our dedicated transports. And to be honest, guys, we've already covered them. This is the Chimera for the Kazakin. I know on the previous slide, I had Kazakin plus Chimera. That was just to show how those two units went together. There are not two Chimeras in this list. There's just one in case someone's there with a calculator adding it up going, Morning Glory, you've overspent on this list. Nope, it's just the one Chimera in the list. It's the one that will be supporting the Kazakin. In terms of loadouts for the Chimera, honestly, doesn't matter so much. I mean, because you are taking Born Soldiers, I would recommend a multi-laser and a heavy bolter. Not only is that going to take advantage of your regimental doctrines, but it's also pretty much the El Clasico of the Chimera loadouts. It's been good and effective in every single edition. Chimeras are a medium armor platform. They're tougher than your Scout Sentinels, but they're nowhere near as tough as your Leman Russes. And their main function is to provide some transport capability and add an element of maneuverability to your list. Having a unit of Scout Sentinels being supported by a Chimera full of Kazakin is actually a great way of forming a spearhead and taking an objective and taking a flank and taking the fight to the enemy. But overall, the Chimera is a pretty straightforward unit. You put men inside it to keep those men safe and to allow them to get around the battlefield quicker. Battle taxis are pretty easy to understand. Just remember, this thing is not a main battle tank. It is an armored personnel carrier. The idea behind it is to provide a bit of extra fire support to the unit it is transporting, but don't try and use this in the same role as your Leman Russ. It will never be able to perform the same way as those dedicated battle tank units. But that's the whole list, guys. So in total, we have got 3 infantry officer squads. We've got 4 battle tanks. We've got 1 piece of medium armor, 1 squadron of light armor. We've got 10 elite infantry. We've got a commissar. We've got some artillery, and we've got 80 warm bodies in our infantry corps. A nice, well-balanced force that will allow you to take advantage of all the different aspects of the Guard, and will also help you learn the faction and how it primarily wants to work on the battlefield. Remember that Guard are a shooting army. Combat is not really our forte, but if you do need to do a cheeky bayonet charge here and there, don't be afraid to do it. Your Kazakin do have 2 attacks each. With fixed bayonets, they can actually surprisingly bully other enemy light infantry, and likewise, fixed bayonets on any of your regular infantry squads will allow them to barney with the enemy light infantry, but they will not be able to do much damage to medium infantry like Marines or anything higher than that. You really want to be focused on shooting your opponent, and this is what this list is designed to do. Shoot the enemy, grind at the table with those infantry, have a little bit of maneuverability, little bit of indirect fire, and a hell of a lot of direct firepower from those heavy tanks. I did say at the beginning of the video that I would mention some secondaries that work well with this army list. I can recommend you taking Inflexible Command. I can also recommend you taking Boots on the Ground. You do have enough infantry and you've got maneuverability with that Chimera to be able to get plenty of Boots on the Ground points. And for that third one, if your opponent hasn't got a list that gives up loads of no prisoners or gives up loads of bring it down points, then you can go for something like Banners, or you can go for something like Retrieve Battlefield Data, because again, you've got that Chimera with those Kazakin in, or you can put a regular squad in there and do some Retrieve Battlefield Data. But Inflexible Command and Boots on the Ground definitely should be your go-tos. Banners and Retrieve Data should be your backup ones if your opponent doesn't have a list that gives up a lot of other secondary points. One last tiny thing that I want to mention. If you are brand new to the Guard, you're brand new to Warhammer 40k, you haven't picked up any box sets yet, if you want my recommendation for what boxes of Warhammer you should be picking up, I would say you can't go wrong with any Cadia stands, because they come with a copy of the Codex and they come with 20 infantry, a command squad, a sentinel, and a field orders battery. Combat patrols are a great way to go as well. The combat patrols do come with a command squad, but remember, the command squad is just a bunch of officer parts. You can use them to easily build Cadian Castellans and also to build things like your commissars as well. So a couple of combat patrols and Acadia stands would definitely be a good way to start your Guard army. And then also, if you are able to pick up some of those old start collecting box sets, get yourself some Leman Russes and some infantry. That's another strong way to go about picking this list up. But all of this is just like my opinion, man. What do you guys think? Are there any units that you think I should have recommended? Is there anything in here that you think I should take out? Let me know down in that comment section below. Don't forget to smash that like button like it is your big titty Eldar girlfriend, and also subscribe to never miss an episode. And if you really enjoyed today's video or you found it particularly helpful, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. By becoming a channel member, not only will you be supporting the channel, but you will also gain access to the Mordian Glory Discord, an online community with over 1,000 active members. It's really exploded over the last 6 months, and it's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got tactics and armor sections, we've got painting and hobbying, and we've even got a pretty spicy meme section as well. And I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you to all of the latest channel members. So a huge thank you to Revan R, Wise Old Worm, Yuki, Raiden, Rob Stark, Leo Dude 2000, Justin, X-Real, Nurgle's Grin, Joe Camel, Jordan Wagster, Manuel, Cozy Strats, Magelix, Chris, Fool's Fate, and the Malevolent Spoon. Thank you guys for doing your part. I also want to do a shout out to the latest Patreons as well. So a massive thank you to Astrid Wilson, Armando, Jens Kimpen, JC, John, Real Steel, and Kobold M. Thank you guys for becoming Patreon supporters. And last, but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the Call of Duty. So a massive thank you to Alan Blunt III, Bonbon Vert, Mark Panconi, Ridemaster 134-4, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, Tom Sutton, and August Varney. Thank you guys. Your generous and ongoing Patreon support really makes a huge, huge difference. I hope you've all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.